The doors sealed behind me before I even reached my seat, and that sound alone told me everything I needed to know. Nobody seals a chamber door like that unless they already know how the vote will go. My name is Ethan Cole, and on that day I was the youngest attaché in the human delegation to the Galactic Concord. I was not supposed to be important. I was supposed to carry data pads, refill water cups, and stay quiet while my superiors spoke. But history has a strange habit of putting ordinary people in the room when the extraordinary happens, and I was in that room when the galaxy decided humanity no longer belonged in it. The Concord chamber was built to make you feel small. The ceiling rose so high that the lights along the top looked like distant stars. Rows of seats climbed upward in a circle, filled with delegates from 11 founding species and dozens of member worlds, all facing a raised platform in the center where the speaker of the Concord stood. I had been in that chamber a dozen times before, and every time I felt like an insect being observed under glass. This time was different. This time, every eye in the chamber was already on us before we even took our seats. Ambassador Laura Bennett walked ahead of me, her back straight, her face calm in a way that I knew took enormous effort to hold together. She had spent 11 years building relationships in that chamber. She had negotiated trade routes, defended human colonies from unfair tariffs, and argued for our right to exist as equals among species who had been traveling the stars since before our ancestors discovered fire. I admired her more than anyone I had ever worked for. Watching her walk toward that platform, I could tell she already knew what was coming. The speaker was a tall being from a species called the viral, silver-skinned, with eyes that never seemed to blink. Their voice carried through the chamber without any need for amplification, a low and even tone that somehow made every word sound final. "Delegation of Earth," the speaker said. "The Council has reached its decision regarding the petition for continued membership." I felt my chest tighten. Beside me, a young translator named Priya Malhotra gripped the edge of her chair. We both knew what a phrase like continued membership usually meant. Nobody used careful diplomatic language like that unless they were about to take something away. "The Council finds," the speaker continued, "that the human species presents an unacceptable pattern of behavior inconsistent with conquered values, repeated conflicts among your own nations, unauthorized weapons research, a demonstrated willingness to act without consulting this body. These findings are not new. They have been recorded for decades. What is new is the Council's patience running out." A murmur rolled through the chamber, not of shock, but of agreement. That was the part that hurt the most. Nobody was surprised. They had already made up their minds long before we walked in. Ambassador Bennett stepped forward. "With respect, Speaker, humanity has made every requested reform. We reduced our military fleets by 40%. We opened our research labs to Concord inspection. We have not engaged in a single armed conflict beyond our own borders in over a decade. What more is being asked of us?" The speaker's unblinking eyes settled on her. "Compliance is not the same as trust. Your species reduces its weapons when asked, then designs new ones in secret. Your species opens its labs, then hides its most advanced projects on outposts beyond our sensor range. We have watched Earth for 3 centuries. You do not change. You only adapt to avoid consequence." I wanted to stand up and argue. I wanted to remind them that humanity had built cities from ash more times than any species in that room, that we had ended wars, cured plagues, and reached the stars in a fraction of the time it took species with far more advantages. But I was not the ambassador. I was a young man holding a data pad, and my voice would have meant nothing in that chamber. "The Council's ruling," the speaker said, "is as follows. Effective immediately, the human species is removed from Concord membership. All human vessels are to withdraw beyond the designated exclusion boundary within 30 standard days. Conquered technology licenses held by human industries are revoked. Trade agreements are dissolved. Diplomatic protections under conquered law no longer apply to human citizens beyond the exclusion boundary. The words landed like something physical. I heard Priya beside me let out a breath she must have been holding for a long time. Somewhere behind us, a member of the military attaché staff whispered a word I will not repeat, but I understood exactly how he felt. Ambassador Bennett did not move for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort behind every syllable. "You are not simply asking us to leave," she said. "You are drawing a wall around an entire species and calling it justice. Humanity has fought for a place in this community since the day we first made contact. We came here in good faith. We built relationships. We buried our dead beside yours during the Threll uprising, and now you cast us out because we frighten you." A delegate from the Karen species, a squat, four-armed being seated near the front, spoke without waiting to be recognized. "You frighten everyone," he said. "That is precisely the point." Laughter rippled through parts of the chamber, quiet and cruel. I felt heat rise in my face. I had heard rumors before, whispered comments from alien colleagues about how humans were seen, but I had never felt the full weight of that condescension until that moment. To them, we were children who had grown too many teeth too quickly. Interesting to observe, useful in small doses, but never to be trusted with anything that mattered. The speaker raised a hand and the chamber fell silent again. "The decision is final. There is no appeal process for this ruling. Human vessels currently within conquered space will be escorted to the exclusion boundary by conquered security forces. This session is concluded." And just like that, it was over. 3 centuries of contact, 300 years of treaties, trade, shared discoveries, and shared losses ended in less time than it takes to eat a meal. I glanced sideways at Priya, whose family had lived on 3 different colony worlds during her lifetime, always moving to stay ahead of border disputes and resource shortages that were never truly our fault, always the result of older species claiming territory first and asking questions later. She was not crying, but her jaw was clenched so tightly I worried she might crack a tooth. Beside her, an older engineer named Daniel Ortiz simply stared at the floor, his hands folded in his lap, as if praying to someone who had already stopped listening for the day. The speaker was not finished. "Furthermore," the viral said, "the Council recognizes the potential for human retaliation or unauthorized movement following this ruling. A permanent monitoring network will be established along the exclusion boundary. Any human vessel found beyond that line without explicit conquered authorization will be considered a hostile presence and dealt with accordingly." Dealt with accordingly. 2 words doing the work of a threat without ever having to say the word threat out loud. That was how the conquered operated. Elegant language wrapped around a closed fist. Ambassador Bennett did not step back, but I saw her hands tighten at her sides. "You call this a ruling," she said. "History will call it something else." The speaker's expression, if a being like that could be said to have an expression at all, did not change. "History is written by those still permitted to speak in this chamber, Ambassador. Earth no longer has that privilege." I do not remember walking out of that chamber. I remember the long corridor outside, lined with flags from every member world, human colors nowhere among them anymore, because someone had already removed our banner before the vote had even been announced publicly. That detail stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that day. They had prepared for this outcome before we walked in. The vote had been a formality. Outside the conquered tower, our transport ship waited on the landing platform, but it was not alone. 6 conquered security vessels surrounded it, sleek and silver, their weapons not aimed at us, not yet, but positioned in a way that made their purpose unmistakable. An escort, a polite word for something closer to a forced removal. Ambassador Bennett stopped at the top of the ramp and turned to look back at the tower one last time. I stood beside her, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "They're afraid," she finally said, quiet enough that only I could hear. That's what this is, not justice. Fear. Afraid of what? I asked. We just gave up our fleets, we complied with everything. She looked at me, and there was something in her eyes I had never seen before, not sadness, but something closer to resolve. They're not afraid of what we've done, Ethan. They're afraid of what we haven't done yet. I did not fully understand what she meant that day. I would understand it fully only years later, when I stood on the deck of a ship that should not have existed, watching those same silver-conquered vessels retreat before us instead of the other way around. But that story comes later. That day, we simply boarded our transport, sealed the doors, and watched through the viewport as the lights of the conquered capital shrank behind us. 6 armed escorts flew close formation around our ship the entire way to the exclusion boundary, a distance that took nearly 2 days to cross. Nobody spoke much during that journey. There was nothing left to negotiate. When we finally crossed the boundary marker, a massive ring of automated buoys stretching farther than the eye could see, the escort ships peeled away without a word. No farewell, no formal handoff, nothing. One moment they were there, and the next, we were alone in the dark, cut off from a community we had spent 300 years trying to belong to. I stood at the viewport long after the others had gone to their quarters, watching those distant lights of conquered space fade into the ordinary blackness of the stars. I thought about everything humanity had given up trying to earn a seat at that table. I thought about the wars we had ended, the sacrifices we had made, the technology we had shared freely even when others hoarded theirs. And somewhere in that quiet moment, staring into the dark beyond the boundary, I felt something shift inside me. Not despair, though there was plenty of that to go around in the following weeks. Something else. A strange, stubborn spark that I would later recognize in the eyes of nearly every human I met beyond that boundary. They had drawn a wall around us and called it exile. They believed they were closing a door. What they did not understand, what none of them understood until it was far too late, was that humanity had never needed an open door to build something new. We had only ever needed a reason. And on that day, they had just given us the greatest reason of all. The first thing you learn about surviving beyond the boundary is that silence is more dangerous than sound. On Earth, silence meant peace. Out there, in the dead space past the exclusion buoys, silence usually meant your sensors had failed, or worse, that something out there did not want to be detected. 6 years had passed since the ruling. 6 years since I stood at that viewport and watched the lights of conquered space fade behind us. I was no longer a junior attaché carrying data pads. I was 28 years old, serving as a communications officer aboard a salvage and supply vessel called the Meridian, one of nearly 400 ships humanity had left after the withdrawal. 400 ships to support a species that once had access to the trade lanes, medical technology, and resources of an entire galactic community. 400 ships, and somehow, we were still here. Those first years after the exile were the hardest thing I have ever lived through, and I say that having later stood in the middle of situations that would have ended most people. Starvation was not an exaggeration on some of the outer colonies. Medical shortages killed more people in the first 2 years beyond the boundary than any conflict humanity had ever fought. Every piece of conquered technology aboard our ships, our engines, our medical scanners, our communication arrays, was designed to be maintained using licensed replacement parts that we no longer had access to. When something broke, and things broke constantly, we could not simply order a new part. We had to build one from nothing, using scraps, using guesswork, using desperation as our only blueprint. I remember the captain of the Meridian, a woman named Laura Kessler, standing in the engine room during our 3rd month beyond the boundary, staring at a cracked coolant regulator that kept our reactor from overheating. We had no replacement. The nearest human shipyard capable of manufacturing one was 11 days away, and our coolant reserves would not last 4. "We fix it," she said simply, "or we die out here. Those are the only two options, so let's stop wasting time talking about which one we prefer. That became something of an unofficial motto during those years. We fix it or we die out here. I heard variations of that phrase from engineers, doctors, farmers, and soldiers across a dozen different colonies. It was not poetry. It was not inspiring in the way stories usually make survival sound. It was exhausting, terrifying, and relentless. But it was also the beginning of something the conquered never expected. Because here is the strange truth about being cut off from a community that always provided the answers. When nobody is coming to fix your problem, you stop waiting for someone else to fix it. You start solving it yourself, in ways nobody else has ever had to. The conquered species had access to advanced technology for centuries, sometimes millennia. Species like the viral inherited technology passed down from their ancestors, refined slowly and carefully over unimaginable stretches of time. They never had to improvise because they never had to. Their engines worked because they always had. Their medical technology healed because it had healed for 1,000 generations before them. They built on top of what already existed. They rarely had to build something entirely new out of desperation. Humanity did not have that luxury. We were forced, almost overnight, to solve every problem those species took for granted, using a fraction of the resources, in a fraction of the time, with our backs against a wall that grew tighter by the month. Our first true breakthrough came from an unlikely place. A colony called New Hendrick, located on a cold moon nobody outside of humanity had ever cared about, became something of a legend among the exiled fleet. It was home to a woman named Elena Vasquez, a materials engineer who had been dismissed from a prestigious Concord-funded research program years before the exile. Criticized for pursuing theories the Concord scientists considered unstable and reckless. I met Elena during a supply run to New Hendrick in our second year beyond the boundary. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, with hands stained permanently from years working with raw metals and chemical compounds. She showed me around a workshop built into the side of a frozen cliff, powered by a jury-rigged reactor that, by every Concord safety standard I had ever studied, should not have been running at all. They told me my alloy theories violated 3 fundamental laws of material science, she said, running her fingers along a strange, dark plate of metal on her workbench. Funny thing is, those laws were only ever tested using their equipment, built with their assumptions. Nobody ever asked what happens if you approach the problem differently. That plate of metal, crude and unfinished as it looked at the time, would eventually become the foundation for something that changed everything for humanity. But in that moment, it was simply one woman's stubborn refusal to accept that the rules other species lived by were the only rules that existed. Not every story from those years ended in discovery. I lost people during that time, colleagues and friends who did not survive the shortages, the equipment failures, the harsh, unforgiving nature of space without a safety net beneath us. I remember a young engineer named Marcus Webb, barely older than I was, who died when a makeshift oxygen regulator failed on a mining outpost we were resupplying. There was no Concord rescue fleet to call, no advanced medical technology to save him. We buried him, along with far too many others, under the cold soil of a world that was never meant to be a graveyard for young engineers. Those losses shaped us as much as the breakthroughs did. Every failure taught us something the conquered had never needed to learn, because failure had never been allowed to teach them anything. They built their civilization slowly, cautiously, protecting what already worked. We were forced to build quickly, recklessly at times, because the alternative was extinction. There was also conflict among ourselves during those years, and I will not pretend otherwise. Different human factions disagreed on how to survive the exile. Some argued for centralizing every remaining resource under a single unified command, believing that only strict coordination could save us. Others argued for independence, believing that scattered colonies experimenting freely would produce more solutions than any centralized authority ever could. Ambassador Bennett, who had become something close to a political leader among the scattered human colonies by that point, spent years mediating between these factions, trying to hold together a species that had every reason to fracture completely under the pressure of its own survival. I sat in on several of those meetings as a junior communications officer, tasked with recording and relaying messages between colony leaders scattered across dozens of systems. I remember one meeting in particular, held aboard a converted cargo vessel serving as a temporary meeting hall, where a colony leader named Robert Klein argued furiously that centralized control was the only path forward. "We cannot afford this chaos," he said, slamming his hand against the table. "Every colony working on its own project, hoarding its own research, refusing to share resources. We will tear ourselves apart before the conquered ever gets the chance." Ambassador Bennett listened patiently before responding. "You are not wrong that we need cooperation," she said, "but you are wrong about what kind. The conquered thrived through control, through slow, centralized development protected by rules that never changed. We do not have the luxury of time that they had. What we have is desperation, and desperation produces more ideas in a single year than comfort produces in a century. Our strength was never going to come from uniformity. It comes from every colony, every engineer, every stubborn dreamer trying something different and sharing what works." That philosophy became the quiet backbone of humanity's recovery during those years. Colonies remained loosely connected through a shared communication network, but each was largely free to pursue its own research, its own survival strategies, its own solutions to the endless list of problems that came with rebuilding a civilization from almost nothing. Some experiments failed spectacularly. Others produced small, incremental improvements that spread slowly across the fleet. And a rare few, like Elena Vasquez's strange dark alloy, hinted at something much larger waiting just beyond our current understanding. Not every threat we faced during those years came from broken equipment or empty supply holds. In our fourth year beyond the boundary, the Meridian encountered a group of scavengers operating near an abandoned mining station, a loose band of independent raiders from a species called the Yoran who had learned that isolated human ships made easy targets. They knew we had no conquered protection, no fleet to call for help, no treaty to shield us from their aggression. For a brief and frightening period, several human convoys were stripped of cargo, sometimes stranded in open space for days before rescue could reach them. I remember the tension aboard the Meridian the day we received a distress signal from a smaller supply ship called the Whitfield, drifting without power after a Yoran raiding party had taken everything of value from its cargo hold, including half its food stores. Captain Kessler made the decision to respond, even though our own fuel reserves were dangerously low. "They have children on that ship," she said, when a junior officer questioned the risk. "We are not the conquered. We do not leave our own people behind because the math looks inconvenient." We reached the Whitfield 2 days later, towed it back to New Hendrick using cables never designed for that kind of strain, and spent the following weeks helping its crew recover. No conquered peacekeeping force arrived to assist us. No diplomatic complaint was filed on our behalf. We handled it ourselves, the way we had learned to handle everything since the exile began. It was during the recovery effort that colony leaders across our scattered fleet began quietly organizing informal defense patrols, crewed by volunteers, armed with whatever modified equipment our engineers could produce. It was not a military in any traditional sense, but it was enough to make raiding humanity a less appealing option than it once had been. By the 5th year beyond the boundary, humanity had stabilized. We were not comfortable, not by any measure the conquered would have recognized, but we were no longer simply surviving day to day. Farms had been established on 3 previously uninhabitable moons using modified soil treatment techniques nobody in the conquered had ever attempted, because nobody in the conquered had ever needed to. Medical shortages eased as human doctors developed treatment methods using locally available materials instead of relying on imported conquered medicine. Our engines, patched together from scraps and stubborn ingenuity, ran less efficiently than Concord designs, but they ran, and they kept running month after month, powered by a determination that no amount of advanced technology could replace. I remember standing on the observation deck of the Meridian during the 6th year, watching a convoy of newly repaired human ships depart on a resource expedition into unclaimed space beyond our territory. 6 years earlier, we had been escorted out of Concord space like criminals, treated as a threat too dangerous to be trusted with membership in a community we had spent centuries trying to earn a place in. Now here we were, scattered but alive, building something entirely our own in the dark spaces the Conquered had never bothered to explore, considering it beneath their interest. Captain Kessler joined me on the observation deck that day, watching the same convoy disappear into the distance. "You ever wonder what they think happened to us?" she asked. "The Conquered, I mean. Do you think they even remember we exist out here?" I thought about that question for a long moment before answering. "I think they assume we're still struggling to survive," I said. "I think they assume exile broke us, the way it was designed to." Captain Kessler smiled, a tired but genuine smile that I had rarely seen from her during those difficult years. "Good," she said. "Let them keep thinking that for as long as possible." I did not fully understand what she meant at the time, though I would understand within the year, when reports began reaching the Meridian about a classified research project taking shape on a distant outpost, one that Elena Vasquez and her strange dark alloy had somehow become deeply connected to. A project that would eventually pull me away from communications duty entirely and place me directly at the center of the very thing that would change everything for humanity and for the galaxy that had cast us aside. Looking back now, I understand that those 6 years were not simply a period of suffering to be endured before better times arrived. They were the forge that shaped everything humanity would become afterward. Every failed experiment taught us something. Every loss hardened our resolve without hardening our hearts, because even in our darkest months, colonies still shared their food, their medicine, and their knowledge freely with one another. We were exiled, poor, and alone in the dark, but we were never truly divided, and that, more than any single invention, was the real reason we survived long enough to build what came next. I think about Marcus Webb sometimes, and the others we lost during those years, and I wonder what they would think if they could see what grew from the wreckage of that exile. I like to believe they would understand that their sacrifice was not wasted, that every hardship those years demanded of us became, in some strange and painful way, the raw material for something the galaxy had never seen before. But that discovery, and everything that followed it, belongs to a different part of this story. The message that changed my life arrived at 3 in the morning, ship time, in the 7th year beyond the boundary. I was asleep in my quarters aboard the Meridian when Captain Kessler woke me herself, something she had never done before in all our years serving together. "Get dressed," she said. "You have a transfer order effective immediately." I sat up still half asleep. "A transfer to where?" "An outpost called Ridgeline Station," she said. "Classified project. I don't have clearance to know what it involves, and frankly, neither do you yet. But your name came through personally requested, which means someone up the chain remembers you from the diplomatic corps." I did not know it then, but that transfer order would place me at the center of the most important project humanity had ever attempted, one that had been building quietly, secretly, across nearly 2 years of failed experiments, dead ends, and stubborn persistence, all rooted in a single strange alloy that a dismissed materials engineer named Elena Vasquez had first shown me on a frozen cliffside years earlier. Ridgeline Station was unlike anything I had seen since the exile began. Built into a hollowed asteroid far from any established trade route, it was designed specifically to avoid detection, its exterior disguised to resemble ordinary debris drifting through an unremarkable stretch of space. Only a handful of colony leaders knew of its existence, and even fewer knew what was being built inside it. I was met on arrival by a woman named Sofia Alvarez, the project's lead administrator, a sharp, no-nonsense engineer who had spent the early exile years working on emergency reactor repairs before being recruited into this classified effort. "Ethan Cole," she said, studying me carefully as I stepped off the transport. "Diplomatic background, communications experience, and according to your file, you're one of the few people still alive who spoke directly with Elena Vasquez before any of this began. That's exactly why you're here." "Why does that matter?" I asked. "Because Elena refuses to work with anyone she doesn't trust," Sophia said, a faint smile crossing her face. "And apparently, 7 years ago, on a cliffside on New Hendrick, you were kind enough to actually listen to her." I found Elena in the station's central laboratory, older now, her hair streaked with more gray than I remembered, but her eyes carried the same sharp intensity that had struck me the very first time we met. She looked up from a workstation covered in schematics I did not understand, and something like recognition crossed her face. "The junior officer who asked good questions," she said. "I wondered if you'd remember me." Hard to forget someone who told me the Concord's laws of material science were built on flawed assumptions, I said. She laughed a short, tired sound. "Turns out I was right. Come, let me show you exactly how right." What Elena showed me that day was the culmination of nearly 2 years of secret work by a small team of engineers, physicists, and stubborn dreamers scattered across the human fleet, all quietly funneling their research into Ridgeline Station. At the center of the project was her original discovery, an alloy she called resonant lattice metal, capable of storing and channeling energy in a way that defied every conquered model of physics that governed how starship engines and shielding technology were supposed to work. The conquered species had spent millennia refining a single dominant approach to space travel and energy generation, a method built around stable, predictable, and above all safe technology, refined slowly over countless generations. Their engines worked because they had always worked, inherited and improved incrementally, never fundamentally challenged. Elena's research took an entirely different path, one that conquered scientists had dismissed centuries earlier as too unstable and too dangerous to pursue, precisely because it did not conform to the safe, predictable patterns their civilization was built upon. Their models assume energy has to move smoothly, gradually, contained within careful limits, Elena explained, pulling up a series of diagrams on a large display screen. This alloy does not care about smooth or gradual. It allows energy to move in controlled bursts, far more efficient than anything conquered engines produce, but only if you can control the timing perfectly. Get it wrong and you get a catastrophic failure. Get it right, and you get an engine capable of speeds the Concorde considers theoretically impossible. I stared at the diagrams, trying to absorb the scale of what she was describing. "How close are you to getting it right?" Elena exchanged a glance with Sophia. "Close enough to be terrifying," she said. "We've run 17 controlled tests over the past year. 4 ended in catastrophic failure. 2 engineers were seriously injured during those early tests, though thankfully both recovered. But the most recent 3 tests succeeded completely, producing sustained, controlled energy output nearly 4 times greater than our best conventional Concorde-derived engines, using a fraction of the fuel." The weight of that number settled over me slowly. 4 times the output, using a fraction of the fuel. If that scaled successfully to a full-sized Starship engine, it would mean humanity possessed propulsion technology beyond anything the Concorde had ever developed, born entirely from research the Concorde itself had abandoned centuries earlier as too reckless to pursue. "Why has this stayed secret for so long?" I asked. "If this works, this changes everything." Sophia answered before Elena could. "Because it isn't finished, and because the moment word gets out that humanity is developing propulsion technology beyond Concorde capability, we become a target again, this time not for exile, but for something far more direct. We need this fully developed and fully deployed before the conquered learns it exists. Otherwise, they will find a way to shut it down before we ever get the chance to use it. Over the following months, I became deeply embedded in the project at Ridgeline Station, no longer simply a communications officer relaying messages, but an active participant helping coordinate the delicate balance between secrecy and resource sharing across the scattered human fleet. Materials for the project had to be sourced quietly from a dozen different colonies, transported without drawing attention, and assembled by a rotating team of engineers sworn to secrecy, many of whom had lost friends or family during the difficult years following the exile and were determined to see this project succeed, no matter the personal cost. I got to know the small team at Ridgeline Station closely during that time. There was an engineer named Marcus Turner, a quiet, careful man responsible for calibrating the containment fields around each test engine, whose steady hands had prevented at least 2 additional catastrophic failures through sheer meticulous caution. There was a young physicist named Annika Rao, barely out of her 20s, whose theoretical work on energy resonance patterns had solved a critical stability problem that had stalled the project for nearly 4 months before her arrival. And there was Elena herself, tireless, brilliant, and endlessly patient with a project that had already cost so much and still had further to go. Not every week at Ridgeline Station moved forward. There were stretches where the entire project seemed to stall completely, where test after test produced nothing but failure, and the small team grew quietly desperate under the weight of their own ambition. I remember one particularly difficult stretch, roughly 3 months into my time at the station, when 3 consecutive tests ended in shutdown before reaching even half the desired output. Annika Rao, usually so composed, broke down briefly in the corridor outside the control room after the 3rd failure, exhausted from weeks of sleepless nights spent recalculating resonance patterns that refused to behave the way her models predicted. "Maybe they were right," she said to me quietly that evening, sitting alone in the station's small dining area, her food untouched in front of her. "Maybe this really is too unstable. Maybe we are just proving the conquered correct." I did not have an engineering background to offer her real comfort, but I remembered something Ambassador Bennett had told me years earlier, back when I was still a junior attaché watching my species get cast out of a chamber full of judgment. "They said we don't change, we only adapt to avoid consequence," I told Annika. "Maybe that's not an insult. Maybe that's exactly what's going to save us." Whatever comfort those words offered, Annika returned to her calculations the following morning with renewed focus, and within 2 weeks, she identified a critical flaw in how the containment fields were synchronized with the alloy's natural resonance frequency, a discovery that would directly enable the breakthrough that followed. It was a reminder that progress on Ridgeline Station rarely moved in a straight line. It moved the way all human progress seemed to move throughout those exile years, forward through failure, forward through doubt, forward because stopping was never truly an option available to us. The 18th test, conducted nearly 5 months after my arrival at Ridgeline Station, remains one of the most tense experiences of my entire life. The entire team gathered in the station's control room, watching through reinforced viewports as the modified engine, built around Elena's resonant lattice alloy, powered up inside a heavily shielded testing chamber. "Energy output climbing," Annika called out, her eyes fixed on a bank of monitors. 15%, 30%, we're past the failure threshold from test 14 and still stable. Elena stood beside the primary console, her hands clenched at her sides, saying nothing, watching the numbers climb with an intensity that made the entire room hold its breath along with her. 50%, Annika continued. 60, containment fields holding steady. Marcus Turner adjusted something on his console, his voice tight with focus. Field integrity remains within safe parameters. We are clear to continue the sequence. The numbers kept climbing, past 70%, past 80%, into territory no previous test had ever reached without triggering an emergency shutdown. I found myself gripping the edge of the console in front of me, though I had no technical role to play in that moment beyond simply watching history unfold. 95%, Annika said, her voice barely above a whisper now. 98, we are approaching full theoretical output. And then silence, as the numbers hit 100% and held. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Then Elena let out a breath she must have been holding for the better part of a year, and something close to a laugh escaped her, half relief, half disbelief. "We did it," she said quietly. "We actually did it." The engine ran at full sustained output for nearly 6 full minutes before the team initiated a controlled shutdown, unwilling to push their luck any further on the very first fully successful test. But 6 minutes was enough. 6 minutes proved that Elena's theory, dismissed as reckless and unstable by conquered scientists centuries earlier, was not only viable, but capable of producing propulsion technology that outclassed anything the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had ever built. Sophia called an emergency meeting of the small circle of colony leaders aware of the project's existence later that same week, transmitted through a heavily encrypted channel to avoid any possibility of interception. Ambassador Bennett, still serving as the closest thing humanity had to a unified political voice, attended remotely, her image flickering slightly on the station's communication display. "This changes our entire position," she said, after Sophia and Elena had walked her through the test results in careful detail. "For 7 years, we have survived by staying small, staying quiet, avoiding any attention from the conquered. This technology gives us an opportunity to do more than survive, but it also creates enormous risk. The moment we begin deploying this at any meaningful scale, the conquered will notice, and when they notice, they will not simply watch quietly." "We are aware of the risk," Sophia said. "That is exactly why we are not proposing to announce this to anyone. We propose a careful, controlled expansion. Retrofit a small number of ships first, test their performance under real conditions, and continue refining the technology before it ever becomes visible beyond our own territory." Ambassador Bennett was quiet for a long moment, studying the test data displayed before her. "And if the conquered does discover it before we are ready?" Elena spoke then, her voice steady despite the gravity of the question. "Then we will already have an advantage they never expected us to develop. An advantage built from the very theories they themselves abandoned as too dangerous to pursue. If they discover it, let them discover it on our terms, not theirs." The Council ultimately approved a careful, limited expansion of the project, authorizing the retrofit of 3 additional ships beyond the original test platform, with Ridgeline Station remaining the central hub for continued research and development. I remained at the station for the following year, watching as Elena's resonant lattice technology evolved from a fragile, dangerous experiment into something approaching a reliable, functioning system, refined through dozens of additional tests, each one bringing the technology closer to something that could genuinely be deployed across the wider human fleet. During that year, the team at Ridgeline Station grew from a handful of engineers into nearly 40 specialists, each recruited quietly from colonies scattered across human territory, each vetted carefully and sworn to secrecy before being brought aboard. Sofia Alvarez managed that growth with a steady, careful hand, insisting that every new arrival be integrated slowly, tested for reliability before being given access to the project's most sensitive details. We could not afford a single leak, not when the entire advantage of this technology depended on the conquered remaining unaware of its existence for as long as possible. I watched Elena change during that year as well. The exhausted, cautious engineer I had first reunited with slowly gave way to someone more confident, more certain of the path forward, though never careless about it. She insisted on personally reviewing every test result, every safety report, refusing to let success make her careless with the lives of the people working under her. When a 19th test produced a minor containment fluctuation that injured no one but came uncomfortably close to a serious failure, Alina halted all further testing for nearly 3 weeks, insisting on a complete review of every safety protocol before allowing the project to continue. "We are not building this to prove a point," she told the assembled team during that review. "We are building this so our people never have to bury someone like Marcus Webb again because we lack the tools to save them. If we lose sight of that, we lose the only reason any of this matters." Her words stayed with me long after that meeting ended, a reminder that everything happening at Ridgeline Station was never truly about outpacing the conquered or proving humanity's worth to a galaxy that had already judged us unworthy. It was about survival, about protecting the people who had endured so much already, about ensuring that the sacrifices of those early exile years would never be repeated if humanity could help it. During that year, I also began to understand something that would only become fully clear to me later, when the wider galaxy finally learned what humanity had built in the silence of its exile. This technology was never simply about faster engines or more efficient fuel consumption. It represented an entirely different philosophy of innovation, one born from necessity rather than comfort, from desperation rather than inherited privilege. The conquered species built their civilization slowly, protecting what already worked, refining incrementally across countless generations who never had to question the fundamentals of their own technology. Humanity, cast out and left with nothing but scraps and stubborn determination, had been forced to question everything, to abandon assumptions the moment they proved insufficient, to embrace theories other species considered too reckless simply because reckless was sometimes the only path forward when survival itself was at stake. That difference, more than any single engine or alloy, was the real breakthrough Ridgeline Station represented. I remember standing beside Alina during the final major test I witnessed at the station, watching as a fully retrofitted supply vessel completed a journey between two distant points in a fraction of the time any conquered ship could have managed, using a fraction of the fuel their engines required. 7 years ago, I said quietly, they told us we were too unpredictable to be trusted, that we didn't change, we only adapted to avoid consequence. Alina watched the retrofitted vessel complete its final approach, a small, satisfied smile crossing her tired face. "They were half right," she said. "We didn't change, we adapted. They just never imagined what we might adapt into." I did not know it then, standing on that quiet asteroid station far from any established trade route, that within a matter of months, the wider galaxy would begin to notice that something had changed beyond the exclusion boundary. A conquered patrol vessel, investigating unusual energy readings near the edge of human territory, was about to become the first outside witness to what humanity had built in the silence of exile. And when they saw it, nothing about the galaxy's understanding of humanity would ever be the same again. The alarm on Ridgeline Station tore through my sleep at a volume I had never heard used before, a sharp, insistent tone reserved for only the most serious emergencies. I was on my feet and dressed within minutes, running through the narrow corridors toward the control room, my heart pounding harder than the alarm itself. Sophia was already there when I arrived, along with Alina and Marcus Turner, all three staring at the main display with expressions I did not like at all. "What's happening?" I asked, breathless. "A conquered patrol vessel," Sophia said, her voice tight. "It picked up unusual energy readings from our last test 3 days ago. It's been quietly moving through this sector ever since. And now it's changed course directly toward us." My stomach dropped. 3 years of careful secrecy, of quiet expansion, of protecting the most important discovery humanity had made since the exile began. And now, a single conquered patrol vessel had found us by accident, simply by being close enough to notice something unusual in the data. How long until it reaches us? I asked. 6 hours, Marcus said. Maybe less if they increase speed. Alina's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. We have two options. We shut everything down, disguise the station as best we can, and hope they lose interest. Or we accept that this moment was always coming eventually, and we decide how we want them to find us. Sophia looked at her sharply. You're suggesting we let them see it. I'm suggesting we stop pretending we can hide this forever, Alina said. We always knew this day would come. The only question was whether it happened on our terms or theirs. A single patrol vessel, alone, investigating a minor anomaly, is a far better first encounter than a full conquered fleet arriving after months of suspicion and speculation. The debate that followed consumed nearly 2 hours of our rapidly shrinking window, conducted over an encrypted channel with Ambassador Bennett and several colony leaders who needed to weigh in on a decision that would shape humanity's future regardless of which path we chose. In the end, Ambassador Bennett made the final call, her voice calm despite the enormous weight of the decision resting on her words. We do not hide, she said. We have spent 7 years being underestimated, dismissed, cast aside as a species too dangerous and too unpredictable to be trusted. If this conquered vessel is going to discover what we have built, let them discover exactly what we have built. Let them see it clearly, without confusion, without half-truths. It is time the galaxy understood that humanity did not simply survive the exile. We used it. 6 hours later, I stood in the control room alongside Alina, Sophia, and the rest of the senior team, watching a small, sleek Conquered patrol vessel approach Ridgeline Station on the main display. A single officer aboard that vessel, a Karen patrol commander named Das Farrell, opened a communication channel, his four-armed frame visible on our screen, his expression carrying the same careful suspicion I remembered from the delegates in that Conquered chamber so many years earlier. Unidentified station, Farrell said. You are inside restricted monitoring range of Conquered border territory. Identify yourselves and explain the source of the energy signatures detected in this sector 3 days ago. Sophia stepped forward to answer, her voice measured and calm despite the tension in the room. This is Ridgeline Station, operated under human authority. We are conducting research within our own recognized territory, well beyond the exclusion boundary established by Conquered ruling 7 years ago. We are under no obligation to report our activities to Conquered patrols. Farrell's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something between confusion and suspicion. The energy signatures detected exceed known human propulsion capability by a significant margin. Explain the discrepancy. There was a long pause in the control room. Alina glanced at Sophia, then at Ambassador Bennett's image still displayed on a secondary screen. Ambassador Bennett gave a small nod. Show him, she said quietly, all of it. Sophia transmitted a data package to the Conquered patrol vessel, containing carefully selected but genuine information about the resonant lattice engine, its test results, and its performance capabilities. I watched Farrell's expression on the screen as he reviewed the data, his initial confusion slowly giving way to something closer to disbelief. This is not possible, he said finally. This technology exceeds Conquered propulsion standards by a factor of nearly 4. Your species does not possess the theoretical framework necessary to develop something like this. We did not possess your theoretical framework, Alina said, stepping into view of the transmission for the first time. We developed our own. 7 years ago, your council told my species that we did not change, we only adapted to avoid consequence. You were half right. We adapted. We simply adapted into something your framework never anticipated. Farrell was silent for a long moment, studying the data before him with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly how significant this discovery truly was. I am required to report this encounter to Conquered Command immediately, he said finally. We expected nothing less, Ambassador Bennett said, her image steady on the screen. Report exactly what you have seen here today. Tell your command that humanity did not simply survive exile. Tell them we built something greater than anything your civilization considered possible, using theories your own scientists abandoned centuries ago as too reckless to pursue. And tell them that when they are ready to speak with us as equals, they know where to find us. Before withdrawing, Pharaoh paused, his gaze lingering on the display for a long moment. 7 years ago, he said, I served on one of the escort vessels that guided your delegation to the exclusion boundary. I remember thinking your species would not last a single decade without our support. I did not expect to be proven wrong so thoroughly. Most of the galaxy didn't, Elena replied. That was rather the point of underestimating us. The conquered patrol vessel withdrew from the sector less than an hour later, and for several days afterward, Ridgeline Station existed in a strange, tense quiet, waiting to see what consequences that encounter might bring. I remember very little sleep during those days, spent mostly in the control room monitoring communication channels for any sign of conquered response. The response, when it finally arrived 9 days later, was not the military escalation many of us feared. It was a formal diplomatic transmission, requesting a meeting between conquered representatives and human leadership at a neutral location along the exclusion boundary. The tone of the message was markedly different from anything humanity had received from the conquered since the exile began, careful, measured, and notably lacking the condescension that had characterized every previous interaction. In the days between the patrol vessel's withdrawal and the arrival of the formal conquered response, I found myself reflecting often on Captain Kessler, still commanding the Meridian somewhere out among the scattered colonies. I sent her a brief, coded message describing what had happened at Ridgeline Station, uncertain whether it would ever reach her given the communication delays common across our fleet. Her reply arrived 4 days later, characteristically brief. Knew you'd end up in the middle of something important, she wrote. Try not to let it go to your head. And tell Elena the crew of the Meridian says thank you, whatever that turns out to be worth. That small message, arriving amid so much uncertainty, reminded me of something important. Whatever happened next, whatever the conquered decided to do with the knowledge that humanity had built something beyond their comprehension, the true measure of what we had accomplished was never going to be found in a negotiating chamber. It was found in every colony that had shared its last reserves with a stranded ship, every engineer who had refused to give up after a catastrophic failure, every family that had rebuilt a life from nothing on a frozen, unwelcoming world. The technology was remarkable, but it was never the whole story. It was simply the proof, finally visible to the rest of the galaxy, of something that had been true about humanity since the very first day of our exile. Word of the encounter spread quickly through the scattered human fleet in the weeks that followed, despite efforts to maintain some degree of operational security. I traveled with Ambassador Bennett and a small delegation to a colony called Fairholt, where representatives from a dozen human settlements gathered to discuss how to respond to the Conquered's request for a meeting. The atmosphere at that gathering was unlike anything I had experienced since before the exile, a strange mixture of cautious hope and hardened determination. They spent 7 years believing we were broken, said a colony leader named Grace Whitmore, addressing the assembled representatives. Now they know otherwise, and they will try to find a way to use this knowledge against us, or to control it, the same way they tried to control us before. We cannot walk into this meeting as the desperate exiles they remember. We must walk in as something they have never had to negotiate with before, an equal they did not create, did not grant permission to exist, and cannot simply dismiss. Ambassador Bennett, who would lead the delegation into this critical meeting, spoke last that day, her voice carrying the same steady resolve I remembered from the moment we were escorted out of conquered space 7 years earlier. For 7 years, we built something in silence, driven by necessity, shaped by loss, refined through failure. That process is finished. What comes next is not about proving ourselves worthy of a seat the conquered once denied us. It is about deciding, on our own terms, what relationship we want with a galaxy that will never again be able to treat humanity as a problem to be contained. I felt something shift in that room as she spoke, a collective recognition among everyone gathered that the exile, whatever pain and sacrifice it had demanded, had fundamentally changed what humanity was capable of becoming. We were no longer simply hopping to be allowed back into a community that had cast us aside. We were preparing to meet that community as something it had never encountered before and would never fully understand. News of the encounter, and the technology behind it, eventually reached beyond conquered official channels as well. Independent traders and smaller species along the border began quietly seeking out human colonies, curious about the rumors spreading through unofficial networks about a species that had been exiled, and had somehow emerged from that exile stronger than before. Some of these encounters were cautious and transactional, traders looking for opportunity in a shifting balance of power. Others carried a genuine curiosity that reminded me, oddly, of the earliest days of humanity's original contact with the wider galaxy, before judgment and condescension had defined so much of that relationship. I remember one particular encounter during that period, aboard a trading outpost near the edge of human territory, where a young viral merchant named Illith approached our delegation with none of the careful superiority I remembered from the conquered chamber years earlier. "Is it true," she asked, her tone genuinely curious rather than dismissive, "that your engineers built this technology using theories our own scientists rejected centuries ago?" "It's true," I told her. She was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I had never seen directed at a human before, something closer to respect than the pity or suspicion I had grown used to. "We spent centuries believing our way was the only way that mattered," she said finally. "Perhaps we were the ones who never truly changed." That single conversation stayed with me longer than almost anything else from those tense, uncertain weeks following the discovery of Ridgeline Station. It was a small moment, one merchant speaking honestly to one human, but it represented something larger beginning to shift across the galaxy. A quiet recognition that the species they had exiled 7 years earlier as too dangerous and too unpredictable to be trusted had become something none of them had ever prepared for. The formal meeting between conquered representatives and human leadership was scheduled to take place within the month, at a neutral station along the exclusion boundary, the very line that had separated our two peoples for 7 long years. As preparations began for that meeting, I found myself thinking back to the moment I stood in that conquered chamber as a young attaché, watching the doors seal behind me before the verdict was even announced, feeling the full weight of a galaxy, deciding that humanity did not belong among them. 7 years later, I would walk through those same kinds of doors again, not as a dismissed exile pleading for reconsideration, but as part of a delegation that no longer needed the conquered's approval to matter. Whatever happened at that meeting, one truth had already been established beyond any argument. The wall they had built around humanity had not broken us. It had simply given us the space, the desperation, and the freedom to become something they had never imagined possible. The neutral station where the meeting would take place had once served as a minor trade outpost along the exclusion boundary, a modest structure that suddenly found itself hosting the most consequential diplomatic encounter since the day humanity had been cast out of the conquered. I stood at the airlock alongside Ambassador Bennett, Elena Vasquez, and Sofia Alvarez, waiting for the doors to open onto a docking bay already filled with conquered vessels, far more numerous than the size of the meeting seemed to require. "They're nervous," Elena murmured, studying the assembled ships through the viewport. "Look at how many escorts they brought for what is supposed to be a simple diplomatic conversation." "Let them be nervous," Ambassador Bennett said. "Nervous is better than dismissive. Nervous means they're finally taking us seriously." The doors opened, and we stepped into a docking bay that felt distinctly different from the grand, imposing Concord chamber I remembered from 7 years earlier. There were no towering ceilings designed to make visitors feel small, no elaborate displays of conquered authority and history lining the walls. It was simply a modest meeting room, hastily prepared, its plainness perhaps the clearest signal yet of how thoroughly the Concord's confidence had been shaken. The Concord delegation was led by a new speaker, a viral named Solon Carr, accompanied by several senior representatives, including, to my genuine surprise, Das Farrell, the patrol commander who had first discovered Ridgeline Station months earlier. His presence, I would later learn, had been requested specifically by Ambassador Bennett, a small but deliberate reminder that this meeting existed because of a single officer's honest report rather than any grand Concord strategy. Speaker Carr studied our delegation carefully as we took our seats across from theirs, his expression far more guarded than the confident condescension I remembered from speaker before him. "Ambassador Bennett," he said, "it has been 7 years since your species stood before this council." "It has," Ambassador Bennett replied evenly, "though I suspect this meeting bears very little resemblance to that one." "Indeed," Carr said. "We have reviewed the data provided by Commander Farrell extensively over the past month. Our scientists remain, frankly, unable to fully explain how a species with no prior access to advanced propulsion theory developed technology exceeding our own capabilities within the span of a single exile." "They had access to something you never accounted for," Alina said, speaking for the first time. "Necessity. Your civilization built its technology across thousands of years of stability, refining what already worked because it never had to question whether that approach would keep your people alive. We did not have that luxury. Every solution we developed came from the immediate threat of losing something or someone we could not afford to lose. That kind of pressure produces a very different kind of science than the one your researchers are accustomed to." Carr was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words with an expression I found difficult to read. "The council that exiled your species did so out of genuine concern," he said finally. "Concern that human unpredictability, human willingness to act outside established frameworks, represented a danger to the stability this community has maintained for millennia. And now that concern has been proven correct," Ambassador Bennett said. "We are unpredictable. We do act outside your established frameworks. The only difference is that 7 years ago, you believed that made us dangerous enough to exile. Today, I suspect you are beginning to understand that it also makes us valuable enough that you cannot afford to ignore us any longer." A ripple of quiet tension moved through the Concord delegation at those words. I watched several representatives exchange glances, clearly uncomfortable with how directly Ambassador Bennett had named the true purpose behind this meeting. "We are prepared to discuss reinstatement of Concord membership," Carr said carefully, "under updated terms that reflect the current situation." "We did not come here seeking reinstatement," Ambassador Bennett said, and I felt the entire room shift at those words. 7 years ago, humanity petitioned this council for the right to belong among you, to be granted a seat at your table through your approval. That petition was denied, and in denying it, you inadvertently freed us from ever needing your approval again. We did not come here today to ask for membership. We came to discuss what relationship, if any, our two civilizations wish to build going forward, as equals on terms neither side dictates unilaterally." Carr's composure faltered slightly. The first genuine crack I had seen in the careful diplomatic mask he had maintained since the meeting began. "You are suggesting an entirely new framework, one that has never existed in the history of this council." "We are suggesting exactly that," Alina said, "because the old framework was never built to accommodate a species like ours. It was built to slowly absorb newer civilizations into an existing structure, on the Concord's terms, at the Concord's pace, according to standards the Concord itself defined. That framework worked for every species that came before us because none of them were ever forced to develop an entirely independent path, the way exile forced upon humanity. The negotiations that followed stretched across nearly 3 full days, far longer and far more complicated than the brief, decisive ruling that had ended humanity's original membership 7 years earlier. I sat through countless hours of careful, deliberate discussion, watching as Ambassador Bennett, Alina, Sophia, and a small rotating group of human representatives worked to establish something the galaxy had genuinely never seen before, an agreement between the conquered and an independent human civilization, built on mutual recognition rather than hierarchy. One especially tense session, held during the afternoon of the second day, nearly collapsed the entire negotiation entirely. A Karen representative named Torv Bassin, one of the more skeptical voices within the conquered delegation, argued forcefully that granting humanity full sovereign recognition without any oversight mechanism would set a dangerous precedent for every other species watching this negotiation unfold. You are asking this council to treat an unproven, newly independent power as a full equal, with no mechanism to ensure stability, Bassin said, his voice sharp with frustration. What happens when your species decides, in another 7 years, that its ambitions extend beyond your current borders? What safeguard exists to protect the rest of this community from that possibility? The room fell silent, waiting to see how our delegation would respond to a challenge that struck directly at the heart of every fear the conquered had harbored about humanity since our very first contact centuries earlier. Sophia Alvarez answered before Ambassador Bennett could speak, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. The same safeguard that exists between every other sovereign civilization in this galaxy: mutual respect, fair trade, and the basic understanding that cooperation benefits both sides more than conflict ever could. You do not demand that safeguard from any other independent power in this conquered. You are asking for it now only because you are uncomfortable with a species you once believed you could control and no longer can. Bassin did not respond immediately, and for a long moment I genuinely believed the entire negotiation might fall apart over that single exchange. It was Commander Farrell, seated quietly among the conquered delegation, who finally broke the tension. "I have seen firsthand what this species built in isolation," he said, addressing his own delegation rather than ours. "I do not believe any mechanism of control we might propose would have prevented that outcome, and I do not believe imposing one now would accomplish anything beyond insulting a civilization we very clearly underestimated once already. I would rather negotiate honestly with an equal than attempt, and likely fail, to control a power we no longer have the ability to contain." His words seemed to shift something within the room, and though Bassin remained visibly unconvinced, the negotiation resumed without further collapse. I found myself deeply grateful in that moment for a single conquered officer whose honesty during a routine patrol months earlier had somehow grown into a quiet, unexpected advocate for treating humanity fairly. There were difficult moments throughout those 3 days. Certain conquered representatives pushed hard for exclusive access to human propulsion technology in exchange for renewed trade privileges, an offer Ambassador Bennett rejected without hesitation. "Our technology exists because we built it ourselves, through sacrifice you cannot fully measure," she told the delegation during one particularly tense session. "It will be shared through fair, negotiated trade agreements, the same as any other technology exchanged between independent civilizations. It will not be handed over as tribute in exchange for privileges we no longer require simply to survive." Other moments carried a strange, quiet warmth I had not expected to find in that room. During a break in negotiations on the second day, I found myself in conversation with Commander Farrell, who approached our delegation's small resting area with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than diplomatic obligation. I have been thinking about something since our encounter at your station, he said. Your species was given 30 days to withdraw from conquered space 7 years ago. 30 days to abandon centuries of relationships, trade, technology access, everything your civilization had built alongside ours. I do not believe any other species in this conquered could have survived that, let alone emerged from it stronger than before. Most of us didn't believe we would survive it either, I admitted. The first 2 years were the hardest thing any of us had ever lived through. People died from things that would have been easily treatable with conquered medicine we no longer had access to. Ships fell apart because we couldn't replace the parts we needed. There was nothing certain about our survival, let alone what came after. Farrell studied me for a long moment. And yet you built something none of us thought possible, using theories our own scientists dismissed generations ago. Why do you think that is? I thought about that question carefully before answering. Because your species never had to imagine failure as a real possibility, I said. You built your civilization slowly, protected by resources and stability that never truly ran out. We built ours in exile, where failure meant losing people we loved, and success meant nothing less than survival itself. That kind of pressure changes what a civilization is capable of, in ways I don't think your framework ever accounted for. By the third and final day of negotiations, a framework had finally taken shape, one unlike anything that had existed in conquered history. Humanity would remain an independent civilization, recognized formally by the conquered as a sovereign power rather than a member species subject to conquered governance. Trade agreements would be established on equal terms, negotiated individually rather than dictated by existing conquered hierarchy. Human territory beyond the former exclusion boundary would be formally recognized as sovereign space, with humanity retaining full authority over its own laws, technology, and development. When the final agreement was signed, Speaker Carr addressed our delegation one last time, his tone carrying none of the cold detachment I remembered from the chamber 7 years earlier. I will not pretend this council fully understands what your species has become, he said, but I believe we finally understand what we failed to understand 7 years ago. Exile does not always break the species you cast out. Sometimes, it simply gives them room to become something you were never prepared to face. Ambassador Bennett rose from her seat, and for a moment, I saw something in her expression that I recognized instantly. The same steady resolve I had witnessed the day we were escorted out of conquered space, transformed now into something closer to quiet triumph. 7 years ago, she said, your council told my species that we did not change, we only adapted to avoid consequence. You were right about one thing, we adapted. What you never understood was that adaptation, given enough time, enough loss, and enough determination, becomes something far more powerful than simple avoidance. It becomes reinvention. And a species capable of reinventing itself entirely, on its own terms in the face of complete isolation, is not a species that needed your table to matter. We built our own. I stood beside her as she spoke those final words, thinking back to that terrified young attaché who had sat helplessly in a conquered chamber years earlier, watching his species get cast aside by a community that believed itself untouchable in its judgment. I thought about Marcus Webb, buried beneath cold soil on a world that should never have needed to become a graveyard. I thought about Elena Vasquez, dismissed and ridiculed for theories that would eventually reshape humanity's place in the galaxy. I thought about every colony that had shared its last reserves, every engineer who had refused to stop after catastrophic failure, every family that had rebuilt an entire life from nothing beneath unfamiliar stars. None of them had known, during those darkest years of exile, that the wall the conquered built around humanity would eventually become the very thing that set us free to become something greater than membership in their community could have ever allowed. We did not return to the conquered as the desperate exiles they remembered. We returned as architects of our own future, having built, in the silence of our banishment, something the galaxy had never imagined and could never have granted us permission to create. We returned to human territory 3 days later, and I will never forget the celebrations that greeted our delegation across nearly every colony we passed through in the weeks that followed. On New Hendrick, where Alina had first shown me her strange dark alloy on a frozen cliffside so many years earlier, the entire settlement gathered in the open air despite the bitter cold, cheering as our transport descended toward the landing platform. Captain Kessler was there among the crowd, older now, her hair grayer than I remembered, but her smile as genuine as the day she had told me that we fix it, or we die out here. "Told you," she said, pulling me into a brief, fierce embrace the moment I stepped off the transport. "Knew this species had more in us than anyone gave us credit for." I spent that evening walking through New Hendrick with Alina, both of us quiet for a long while, taking in the sight of a colony that had once struggled simply to keep its people fed and warm, now filled with laughter, music, and the unmistakable sound of a species finally allowed to breathe after 7 years of relentless struggle. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if the conquered had never exiled us?" I asked her, as we stood near the edge of the settlement, looking out over the frozen landscape beneath a sky full of unfamiliar stars. Alina considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think we would still be waiting for their permission to matter," she said. "I think we would have spent decades, maybe centuries, trying to prove ourselves worthy of a seat at their table, shaping our ambitions around whatever they were willing to allow us to become. Exile was difficult, and it cost us more than I think either of us can fully measure, but it also gave us something they never intended to give us. It gave us the freedom to stop asking for permission entirely." I thought about Marcus Webb again in that moment, and about every name I had learned and lost during those difficult early years of survival, names that would never appear in any conquered record, names that mattered only to the people who had loved them, and the small, stubborn colonies that had refused to let their sacrifice be meaningless. I thought about how strange it was that a ruling meant to diminish an entire species had instead become the exact conditions necessary to forge something the galaxy had never encountered before. As our delegation prepared to depart the neutral station and return to the territory we now held not as refugees, but as a sovereign and equal civilization, I found myself standing once more at a viewport, watching stars stretch out toward a horizon that no longer represented a boundary, but simply a beginning. The galaxy had banished humanity, believing it was closing a door on a dangerous, unpredictable species too young and too reckless to be trusted among the stars. What they never understood, what perhaps no civilization built on centuries of stability could ever fully understand, was that humanity had never needed an open door to build something extraordinary. We had only ever needed a reason. And in casting us out, they had given us the greatest reason of all, the freedom to become, entirely on our own terms, something even greater than they ever imagined we could be.